Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. This episode concludes our conversation with Felisa Tibbitts, UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Higher Education and Chair in Human Rights Education at the Human Rights Center of Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Felisa also is a visiting professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Felisa discusses how her teaching experiences in the U.S. and abroad have shaped her thinking and scholarship about HRE, the significance of exploring connections between HRE and social justice, contemporary threats to human rights in the U.S., and how HRE can be deployed to address them, along with her views on how the global HRE movement is developing with suggestions on strategies to advance that process. Well, I think that's part of a long tradition, at least in civic education in the United States. There is at least in one tradition in issues-based study that you really need to take a long look at the critiques of what you're talking about. Otherwise, you're going to be effectively creating a silo. So if you don't do that, then I think you fail to really understand that there must be competing views, access to conflicting ideas, and move it forward. Now, you are also, in another aspect of your work, you have been a co-founder of Human Rights Education Associates, which is an online educational venue. I'd like to know more about, and I think the audience would too, how that evolved over time and what are you doing with it now?
Oh, well, thanks for that question. So HREA, Human Rights Education Associates, was actually founded in Amsterdam in the Netherlands in 1996. It was right after, it was basically the continuation of my work with the Netherlands Helsinki Committee. So actually in the origins of HREA, I was doing similar project work that I'd been doing before, working with ministries of education and NGOs to help them develop human rights education learning materials that would be relevant for their own context. So I continued to do that actually for a number of years. And what happened is that the post-authoritarian Central Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union, we had then had the Balkan Wars. And so then some of my work went into that area. So I did that work actually for a while, but in the late 1990s, or in the mid-1990s, that's when we also remember the internet. There was a beginning of the internet, and it was sometime, I think it was the mid-1990s. What year was it, Bill, that we got the internet? Do you remember?
I can remember going to a workshop when I was still working in public schools to look at Mosaic, one of the first browsers, and that had to be, I'd say, 1995, 1996, 1997.
That's what I remember too. Around 1996, internet happened, and then HREA got a home online, and then we decided, because I was at that point, every time I traveled, I'd have a luggage full of books to give educators on participatory methods of instruction and so forth. And I thought, let's just put as much as we can online. So that became one of our if you will, sort of our lighthouse programs, which is our online resource center. Now there are many more. There are lots of organizations that have human rights education libraries online, including HRE USA. But back in 1996, there weren't none. So we had a lot of foot traffic to the online resource center, and we still have the online resource center to this day. But happily, there are also other places where people can go to look for resources that might be relevant for their own teaching and learning. So the other thing that happened, though, in the late 1990s is with the internet is this prospect of online learning. So we started, it's true, at HREA, we started a online learning program in the late 1990s. And at that time, we didn't have anything. We didn't have Moodle. I don't think we had Blackboard. So we basically, I don't know how we got the idea, but we got the idea somehow. We got some seed money from the Dutch Foreign Ministry and just had a couple of pilot classes that we taught online. And to our surprise, they were really popular and they were successful. So we decided to expand and to begin to charge funding. And that's how we got into online learning. And at our peak, I think we were offering, my gosh, at least 20 courses a year. So we've had a lot of people go through our courses. And again, times change, technology evolves. Now we've got MOOCs, and we have a lot of organizations offering their own online staff development programs for themselves, or Amnesty International has this whole, Human Rights Academy online, which is terrific, where people can just come in and have participated self-paced courses. So our courses at HRE were always instructor-led. So they would go from anywhere from 4 weeks to 8 weeks. People would be, they'd have written assignments, they get feedback from the instructor. So it's still different than a MOOC, still different from some of the HRE that's happening with Amnesty. So it's a complement now. I'm actually offering a human rights education course. Now I'm teaching an online course in HRE, and it was filled. I was very happy that it filled up with people actually mostly from Amnesty International and national human rights institutions. So again, the clientele I used to work with in the past, people in the field who want to be doing HRE and maybe haven't had a lot of exposure to in this either curriculum development or pedagogy or what have you. So we're still offering some courses, just a few at HRE. I'm focusing on HRE right now. Our sister organization, Human Rights Campus, offers a couple of courses a year on gender mainstreaming. So much more low key now, Bill, but we still do have some online courses in HRE. And I'm going to do one on SDG 4.7 and curriculum development this fall. And hopefully every year we'll be offering the HRE course. So it's still happening, a little bit more low key than in the past, but I think we're still filling a need for some organizations and individuals.
Well, you were at the forefront, though, and I think your work has been, in a sense, a barometer of where we've headed. Right? We've started from this sort of very basic internet. Now we have a much more complex internet. You have to find different audiences. You meet their needs as you go along. But you've also been a teacher, and you've taught in North America, Europe, and Africa. So my question is, looking at those different environments, do you find the problems being primarily local that you address through HRE lens, or do you see them as relatively universal in focus? And how would you deal with that?
So you're interested in how HRE is looking differently in these countries? Is that the question?
As an example, you've taught at Columbia, but you've also taught in the Netherlands and South Africa. So when you have a different set of students in each location, do you try to focus your emphases on what they're encountering in their own home environment? Or do you see it as a blend of looking at universal concerns and local issues? How do you cater your own teaching to those specific circumstances?
I understand. Well, I guess I have to distinguish between my guest lectures that I do and courses that I teach where I really have, a bit of time with learners, if that's fair. And when I'm asked to do lectures, it's typically really focused on, say, human rights education. So, as you might imagine, there's a kind of there's some basics for human rights education, like, the roots of human rights education, both legal and popular ed, the international human rights education standards, and the different models. In some cases, people are interested, and then what quality human rights education looks like. And I think that is very standard across the different environments in which I lecture in, because these relate to what I think we have robust ideas about what is quality human rights education. And it's general enough, like about, through, and for, that we can use that as a jumping off place for learners to think about their own experiences in human rights education and what they might want to do as educators, if they are educators, because sometimes I lecture for like law students. Last week, I did a lecture on human rights education and human rights with law students in the Netherlands. So I kind of, it depends if they're a teacher audience or not, how much I get into pedagogy. But I think that's pretty, if I have one lecture, typically it's just, of course, if I'm being brought in for, if it's a course, like at Columbia, I have a whole semester, then we have a lot more time, right? We have a lot more to play with, right? Then you can really work much more from the bottom up in terms of the learners in their class and their own interests. And we can have frames for human rights, we can begin with the standards and values, because at some point we need to get those basics, but then we can move into the local environment. Then we can move into praxis around addressing it. And so it depends on how much time there is, really, I would say. But then, so the localization happens through collaborating with learners in the identification of themes of interest to them, and other conditions, if they're teachers, that might influence what they can do in the classroom, or if they're working in non-formal ed as well. So I'm not sure. I mean, I know that Nancy Flowers does a lot of work with trainers in other places. My work has been in the last 10 years primarily in higher education. So it's a little bit slotted into an existing course. So unless it's my course, I don't have a lot of flexibility. I'm not sure how I can describe how to, maybe I'm taking it for granted how I localize, but like I would typically, if in a course on HRE, I would talk about the standards, the human rights standards and values. We'd eventually get into policies, we'd get into pedagogy, we'd get into evaluation. We cover these aspects of, and curriculum development. We would cover all these aspects, but then inside of those, the learners would be given, for example, readings from different parts of the world, case studies, looking at so not only UNESCO ones or UN ones, but also different examples from practice, policy, curriculum, and also problems. I think the problems are also very much shared, like how can we get enough curriculum space, or even if we're doing a training for police officers, having enough time with them so that we really can get deep, right? And have people have good conversations. So I think, I have the frames as kind of set up, but inside those, Bill, I would say, because most of my students also are coming from different parts of the world and not just Americans. So inside those frames, we can have a lot of space for students, typically through their own discussion forums or their own final projects, working out either curriculum or research related to themes and NGOs of interest to them. They could be anywhere in the world.
Now, of course, for many years, there's been quite a bit of work done in scholarship on issues of social justice, whether it's gender, race, class, and so forth. Now, in HRE USA, of which you were a co-founder, there's been a lot of discussion about the connection between human rights education and social justice. And in the United States, and I can only reference the last few days, of course, the killing of or shooting of African Americans, men in particular. How do you see or conceptualize the connections between human rights education and social justice, particularly because there's so much polarization in the United States on this issue?
It's a good question. And I've had this conversation with people in South Africa, other Americans. And actually, just a little over a week ago, I was having a conversation with Mikelinos Zembilas. I don't know if you know him. He's a Greek Cypriot who's written a lot on peace education and human rights education. And we had this, this is part of our conversation. And we concluded, and this is also my conclusion, primarily from conversations with people like Mikelinos and others from the Global South, my personal opinion on this is that social justice is the wider frame, that it's the umbrella for change efforts that include human rights. It could include anti-racism. It could include decoloniality, etc. So in terms of approaches, I'm happy to consider social justice as the wide frame within which there can be these different modalities for social change. So, and it's not to diminish the power of human rights in its language. It's not to make it equivocal also to other kinds of approaches that might fall under social justice. Anti-racist work is intersecting with human rights and human rights with anti-racist work, but they're also somewhat distinct. So I'm happy to tease this out a little bit more, but that's the way I have decided to work on that frame. And again, I think mostly from my conversations with people in the global South, like in South Africa, as you might know, human rights is it has been a great disappointment, despite the discourse, the human rights in the Constitution, despite the efforts to put it in schools. It's relegated now to life skills, for example. Human rights is inside of life skills. It's at the end of the class. Who knows how many people get exposed to it? So inside of South Africa, they have not been using, generally speaking, but the human rights discourse has kind of fallen into to disrepair, and the language that instead being used is decoloniality or Africanization. So as not to lose the potential for human rights to be accompanying these other discourses and even political movements. I think that social justice allows for it to coexist. Even for those who are maybe skeptical about human rights. Okay, we have human rights, we have anti-racism, we have feminism, we have all these, and we can talk about what's same and different, and I'm happy to do that in a very specific, maybe more technical level. But that's how I see. That's where I've settled on human rights. And again, I'm a human rights proponent. I'm going to advocate for conservation of human rights as the framework for change. But I see social justice as the wider umbrella that encompasses it.
Well, that gets back to, I think, the perennial tension between universalism and particularism. You're going to have universal standard, but you also have particular concerns, and those particular issues in any one location are very locally defined. They're not necessarily universal in focus, but they may connect. I think that's where you're coming from, correct?
Absolutely. And I think the other consideration for me with HRE, as for example, my disappointment when it became increasingly diminished as a discourse in South Africa. What I also felt is that, okay, then if we see social justice as the wider frame, and we recognize that the choice of human rights or feminism or decolonization, not that those are, again, identical discourses or aims, but that's also a choice that people can make as learners, as activists. And they have to make those choices in a way that reflects, again, like you said, localization. And what I also think is that if human rights becomes not the language of choice for a change effort, then it requires those of us who are advocating for human rights and human rights education to make those links, to become relevant again. We have to always replenish and revitalize HR and HRE so it is relevant. And sometimes that relevance is just, or the lack of relevance is just are not getting with the program, like climate change. We've got education for sustainable development. That's the framework that's moving us forward within intergovernmental organizations dealing with climate change. But we need to do that more also in the human rights field. So I think that, yes, localization and also a continuous reminder that we in human rights and human rights education have to also make some changes so that we are dynamic and relevant across a wide range of environments.
Well, it's sort of interesting that you brought that up, because in New Jersey, our state HRE USA chapter is considering a conference in December about the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, but the main focus is going to be environment and climate. So I think that adaptation is critical. If you don't actually understand where the country is headed or where the world is headed, you're going to be left behind, I think.
Agreed.
So I want to ask you about what's happening right now in this country. I mean, there are so many serious social problems in the United States right now, and I just listed a few of them, such as restrictions on voting, censorship, publications, academic freedom restrictions, poverty, gun violence, and so forth. If you may, I'd like to ask you to just take one or two and talk about them from the human rights lens. Because in my view, and I'm just speaking for myself, there's really a paucity of discussion on a number of these issues from a human rights perspective.
Agreed. And I like the question, and I like the the implicit challenge as well, which is how can we link up human rights with these challenges, and also what's the value added in terms of for example, having legislation passed to address some of these, or policies that address them. It's not easy. A frame I've recently come to around human rights and human rights education, I'm trying to think where that came from, because I think it's interesting context for my answer to this question. I know. I'm teaching a course at Columbia this year. I taught it in the fall. I'm teaching it again in the spring. It's a course, a human rights senior seminar. So it's for undergraduates at Columbia, and they're all concentrating in human rights. So it's really it's a crowd that's very amenable to human rights, and they all have to be working on their theses actually in my class. And a part of the class at the very beginning of the class, Bill, I'm going to get to your question, but I'm coming to it from this recent thinking I've been doing, is on this notion of human rights education and disciplines. And in the class, for example, we look at the ways in which disciplinary approaches like anthropology or economics and those researchers have contributed to our understanding of issues that we see as related to human rights, like development economics, or anthropologists looking at culture and universal versus local values. So there's ways in which those disciplines are enhancing our understanding of human rights. And at the same time, the other side of that is that the human rights agenda, if you want to call it that, or the human rights interests or aims, helps to identify themes for research in these disciplines because of the pressing issues in human rights. So it's a kind of reciprocal relationship. And I don't know how, how it is when you're writing something, you just kind of get enamored for a certain period of time. And for me right now, I'm really enamored with this idea. And so this question of like how we can take these very, very difficult and even tragic problems in the United States and address them from a human rights perspective I want to answer in the same way that I feel like we human rights advocates and educators need to find ways where the human rights language for the general public helps to identify injustices and solutions. So we have to figure out what our contribution is to people already involved in, for example, trying to reduce gun violence or to deal with, accepting migrants and refugees. So we have to figure out how our language can help those people advocating for aims that we would say would be human rights aligned. And on the other hand, again, we as human rights educators and human rights people can benefit from those in the sense that there are these real local pressing topics. We need to bring these into our educational efforts, right? So with that preamble, Bill, I think I'd like to look at the problem of gun violence in the United States. And so again, back to what I said earlier, what is it that what can the human rights lens bring to that, and vice versa? What can we do in the human rights field in our own constituents to work with this? So I really like Nicholas Kristof's idea to treat gun violence as a health issue, as a problem of public health. I think that's brilliant. And so what we could do then is to reframe the call to ban assault weapons and other restrictions on gun ownership to be related to the right to health. the right to health. So that's how I would link up the human rights dimension with gun violence to reframe it as a right to health. And this right to health would not only pertain to physical health, and physical injury and being and protected from that, but also mental health, because we know our educators, our teachers, and their learners have incredible stresses now because of the prospect there's going to be gun violence on school campuses. So I think it is affecting the mental health also of people in the school setting. So I think that the right to health is a way to address that. We can bring out these different dimensions of what that right to health might mean, and I think that is advocacy that that language could be used. Will it be generally appealing to the American public? Not for those who are very tried and true gun owners and attached to that, but we're always in these environments you're looking for people who could go either way, right? And this might be one argument you could use. I don't know if it convinces legislators. So one of the issues about some of the seemingly intractable problems we have in the states is that people have political alliances around these, and so I'm just not sure how much wiggle room there is. But on the other side of the gun violence issue, so again, on the human rights education side, what can we do? We can also begin to think about the right to health in regards to gun violence, and incorporate that into some of our own in our own educational work. How we can use a human rights frame to advance legislation in this country to have greater protection against gun violence and restrictions on gun ownership. I'm not sure. I'm not a specialist in that, but this is just one example of how I think we can try to bring human rights into conversation with a very, very troubling phenomenon here in the States.
Well, it seems to imply also that you're going to need to create alliances among different professionals and also among citizen groups who are concerned about these issues, and not necessarily only about weapons, but about public health, for example.
Agreed. Yes, absolutely. We need to be moving out of our dare I say, our kind of our the human rights and human rights education people that we're typically in conversation with. You're absolutely right. We need to come into alliance with these other groups and become part of efforts that are taking place already.
So looking ahead, I mean, you've been a leader in this field for so many years, decades, but now we're also facing the rise of authoritarian governments in Russia, Hungary, Venezuela, and we can go right down the list. Those are serious threats to global HRE, but at the same time, I think you can probably point to some things that have happened on the positive. Where do you think HRE going forward should focus its efforts?
Well, I mean, the short answer, Bill, is that we should just continue to do what we always have been doing in human rights education and continue to expand our efforts, which I think is happening. I think the statistics are showing that human rights education, at least in democratic countries, in countries where it's not a dirty word, is absolutely expanding and deepening. And we also know that what quality human rights education looks like as well. So I think that's very promising. I mean, in terms of backsliding democracies and authoritarianism, I mean, that's one of my big surprises of the last few years is the realization that what we thought would, after the changes in Central Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, this idea that there would be, people would taste democracy, and then there would just be a commitment to democracy, and it would be a linear onward progression towards increasing democracy. And it turns out it's not the case. That politics is cyclical for a variety of reasons. We could talk about that too. So it has been a surprise for me, the cyclical nature of the politics of some countries that I was personally working in for, after in post-authoritarian environments. However, when I worked in those countries in the early 1990s, I was speaking to people who were underground human rights activists, and they talked about how they kept their hopes alive through, alternative education programs, even revolutionary ideas of human rights. So I understand that if we accept that there's a cyclical nature to some political regimes, because there's much more we can say about politics, right? There are countries that have been historically authoritarian, and democracy is more of a kind of something they're just trying on for size, if you will. There's more other countries that have more of a history of democracy, so you have some backslide. And so the degree to which human rights is going to be welcomed wholeheartedly as an ethical framework it depends, and the degree to which countries go through cyclical in treatments of democracy also, it depends on the country context. But regardless, I am convinced that we have to continue to keep teaching about human rights, whether it's with people who are underground or it's above ground, because things will change. Politics change. Even in the United States, it'll become more or less favorable for us to do human rights education. And in countries where we have seen authoritarianism reintroduced, human rights education may be needing to be carried out more carefully, but the people who are aligned with those human rights values also need to feel support from the international community, from allies outside, and to keep them alive intellectually, physically, and focused on their futures is really important. So I really don't see, even though despite all these hiccups in terms of these political developments, I see that we just need to continue to do the same as always. And so I think that is my short response. And I also think that even though we've seen that the environments in which human rights and human rights education can be used is fluctuating and maybe a little fluid for us, I do think that it's still, the bigger picture is that it is still such a powerful discourse. I mean, the fact that countries are still, signing and ratifying human rights treaties, even if they're not abiding by them, that it's part of being part of the international community. I feel like we have a lot of critiques of human rights. It's Western origins, it's questions of universalism and localism, states cherry picking which human rights they want to abide by, the limitations of UN enforcement mechanisms, they're all there, but still human rights is still widely recognized. It's not going away, and the standards will remain. So I think we just have to abide by our commitment to human rights and continue to focus on our efforts as educators to do quality education, to remain relevant, and to respond to the needs of our times in our local environments and in our international environment, our shared environment.
Well, I think that's a great theme for one of your future lectures on the significance of the Universal Declaration. Because if you look back, I mean, my father was a World War II veteran. And if you look back at what he did in the Second World War and what existed in 1945, there were no human rights international standards other than the ones the League of Nations had created, which had been systematically violated. So despite all the struggles, we've come quite a ways in 75 years, I would argue.
Oh, it's actually remarkable. Honestly, I think every once in a while I come across an article and someone is doing big thinking about what is the most remarkable results of the last 100 years, and human rights comes up there. It's amazing. If we think about the League of Nations and that failure, and as flawed, if you will, as the UN system is, I can't imagine a world without it. I can't even imagine if we didn't have international and regional human rights standards. I mean, I just can't imagine to have a place where we can, standards that we can have discussions about. The fact that we're struggling with universalism and localism, but we have something to be looking at and discussing. It's really remarkable. And human rights is not going away. I mean, if you look at, I don't mean to sound like I'm defensive about it, because I'm not, but I did notice, for example, with the Ukraine war and that tragic war, guess what's first and foremost now? Human rights law, humanitarian laws of war. now we've got the ICC with the arrest warrant for Putin. I mean, it's when we have problems that are like this, or climate change, human rights is the language that people are ready to use, which is terrific. So I really believe that our role is as important as ever. And even if the challenges around human rights language are acute in certain environments, it doesn't mean that the language it doesn't diminish its value. In fact, it means that it's so dangerous, it's not allowed. I mean, if I look at my friends in Turkey that were fired from their jobs teaching human rights at the law school, I mean, one facet of that, of course, and one that I feel very personally empathetic about is they've lost their jobs. And with the Erdogan administration, discussions of women's studies or human rights, people have lost their jobs and put in jail, and it's very disturbing. And you could say human rights has been pushed down, and it's what are we going to do? But the other way of looking at that is that human rights is so powerful a language. It's so it has the potential to be so offer what's the word? It could oh, sorry, the word I'm looking for is to upend or to challenge, I say, the Erdogan administration in lieu of a better word, that it has to be made illegal. So the fact that it's made illegal in these countries speaks to its power, which is I think another way of seeing this backsliding, at least in terms of human rights and the constriction of civic space, including the work of human rights organizations. So it's, again, having, worked with people in the early 1990s who were underground, and knowing activists in Ukraine, knowing activists in Myanmar, knowing that they're still out there, and we who can need to be allies and keep them safe in terms of the work they're doing in human rights and human rights education, for sure. But this is a long haul. This is, human rights is the long story, right? And we do what we can in the moment, but it's not going to go away. I don't think it's not going to go away.
So to bring our discussion to an end here, I just wanted to pose our standard 3 questions, and let me ask you the first one. Who would be the most influential role model for your work in HRE? And that's either living today or no longer living.
Well, I think that the role model that I had, because as I said earlier, Bill, it's a nice question. I came to human rights later in life, as I mentioned to you, only in my 30s. But my role model for, I think, wanting to make a difference is actually here. And that's what I felt when I was a child. So from my childhood years, my role model, I would say, was Helen Keller. And maybe not all the listeners will know who Helen Keller was, but she was an American woman who was born both deaf and dumb and blind, and she learned to communicate, and she became a world famous advocate not only for people with disabilities but also for women and for many other human rights causes. And I remember learning about her when I was a child, and she was also such a nice person. And I remember admiring, and now I look back and just admiring her incredible fortitude. But also, I think her model for me is that the notion that you can have a life's work, and her life's work came from also her life's experience. So she inspired me, Bill, at an early age to be strong and to put your heart and soul into your life passion and to be a light to others. So I think that I think that I've never thought about her in terms of influencing my HRE work, but with your question, I think that she influenced my goal implicitly to do something with my life in a complete way.
Well, here's a little tidbit. My father heard her speak
Oh, really?
She came to his high school in Jersey City, New Jersey, when he was a high school student.
Oh my goodness. Does he remember anything she said, or
It's
did he
hard to
tell
say.
you?
I don't think he really could tell me that. Well, he's deceased now, but I think he was impressed by it because, she had really tremendous courage.
Oh, yes. It's exactly the courage is what
Yeah.
I remember reading about. And that her demeanor was she was so, how lucky your father was. That's amazing. But yeah, the courage she had and the fortitude, just unbelievable. Well, he was very fortunate. I would have loved to have met her, to seen her even. Yeah, terrific.
So our second question is, what quote most effectively sums up your view about the importance of human rights?
I don't have a favorite quote. I don't. I'm so sorry. I have longer pieces of literature that have inspired me. I have favorite quotes from the Dalai Lama, or, I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't give you a wonderful quote. Maybe the one that I have had on my refrigerator for a long time is be the change you want to be, something like that. I'm sorry. It's.
Sure. Oh,
I
don't
wish
be
I had
sorry.
something more. That's all. That's all that comes to mind for me, without a much longer quote.
And if you had the power to make one critical change to advance HRE in the United States, what would you do?
I would require that every student in the United States learn about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When HRE USA was founded, that was the goal that I articulated to some of my colleagues. A lot of us agreed on it. And I don't mean like superficial treatment of UDHR, but really
Right.
learn about human rights. So that would be my goal.
Well, I actually think that we're slowly moving in that direction, as you pointed out before, but we still have a ways to go. And I know that if you're staying in the fight, that we're going to be very, very strong as we move down that road.
I hope so. Well, there's a lot of us who are more and more engaged in HREs, and that's very exciting. And I agree with you. I think the curriculum standards in the states are also bending more towards the human rights, although with critical race theory and some of the problems and the culture wars at our school level, I don't know.
Well, I think those are challenges we have to take on, though.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
Well, Felisa, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate you giving us your time today.
Phil, it's been really fun to speak with you. Thanks for these really interesting questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation with you, and I look forward to seeing you in person in New York City before not too long.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Tabrugan, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.